Hey, my friends, happy Sunday. So good to see you. Hey, I got to see a lot of you this week. I talked to some of you on Zoom this week, and I got to see some of you at the baseball game. So if you guys are watching and you have any questions or if you want to just chat sometimes, feel free to let me know. I would love to know who's watching by video still and who we could just chat a little bit and communicate. But let's get to our lesson, okay? Today, I thought I would sit next to the word bloom because as we're wrapping up summer and we're wrapping up the end of our unit, do you guys remember what it's called? Great, guys and gals for God. Yes. All right. So as we're wrapping it up, I'm seeing like a little pattern. Are you guys seeing it? Where the people we're talking about, they kind of bloomed where they were planted. Have you ever heard that phrase? What that means is basically wherever you're at, do what you need to do. Grow where you're at. Bloom where you're planted means wherever God has you, do good things for Him there, right? All right, so I want you guys to see if you could bloom where you're planted the rest of the summer. I bet you can. All right, so let's see who's bloomed. Let's see Esther. We talked about Esther. She had to be very brave where she was, right? And she did, and she saved her people. What about Daniel? Remember the lion's den? And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in that fiery furnace? They had to stand strong where they were. They had to be bold and not bow down to a false idol, but to stand strong. And did they bloom? Did God save them? First off, yes. And then they led whole groups of people. Those two kings, Darius and Nebuchadnezzar, they came back saying, we're gonna follow our whole kingdom. We're gonna follow the one true God now. We see His power. We see who He is. What about Josiah? Remember young King Josiah? We talked about him. He looked at those idols and he's like, this is not what God wants. And so he had his men go out and crush those idols until they were dust. They could be blown away. And then last 2 weeks, we talked about Hannah, who prayed and prayed for a son and was so faithful. She said, if I could have a son, Lord, I will dedicate him to you and he will serve you all the days of his life. And she did have a son, didn't she? His name is Samuel, which means asked of God. And Samuel grew and he bloomed right where he was planted, right there in the tabernacle. He learned so much about God. He served God by serving Eli, the priest, right? And then he grew in stature and he grew in knowledge of God. And God used him to be a judge, a priest, and a prophet. Man, so many of these great heroes just bloomed where they were planted. So let's see who comes next. Now, I'm going to read to you the story today out of this one because I know you guys have this one at home. Many of you guys have this Bible at home, and it's a great story. But I'm kind of taking you to the end of some things, all right? Because in August, when we start our new unit, we'll be talking a lot about Moses and the Israelites, all right? So this is a little bit of the end, but it's kind of faith-building to see, ooh, look what's going to happen in the end. And you'll see that it is not really the end when we get to this story because God has so much more. All these stories show that God has a plan. He has a plan for Esther and Josiah and Samuel and all of them, but He also has a plan for you. And He has a plan for me. And if we could just hang in there and we could just stay strong and stay bold and follow Him, bloom where He has planted us, He is going to show us that plan. So here's the plan for a man named Josiah. Nope, Joshua. Okay, here we go. After Moses died, God gave His people a new leader, and his name was Joshua. Got it right? Joshua. Miss Jamie's got it right too this time, which means the Lord saves. Joshua was going to lead God's people into a very special land, the one that God had promised to give him. By this time, God's people have been wandering around the baking desert. Do you guys know for how long? For 40 years. All right? So you could imagine how sick they were of sand and anything yellow and tense and walking and being hot. All right, have you guys been hot this summer? All right, think about walking through the desert for 40 years. And some of the reason they were out there that long was God was having to work on their hearts. They were a little grumbly. They were not always wanting to do what God wanted them to do. So God kept them out there. Now, He took care of them. Have you noticed in all these stories how God provides and God protects? Yes, He does. All because it's in His plan. And how happy they were they were finally there to reach the end of the desert and see their beautiful new home, the one God had promised to them. Right there in front of them, all the cool and green and lovely. But there was only one problem. Do you know what the problem was? Jericho. The city of Jericho. Now, Jericho was a city, but it wasn't just any old city. It was a fortress. You know what that means? It means it has big, giant walls, all right? A fortress, and it stopped anyone from getting into that land. The people looked at Jericho, at the big, giant, scary walls around it, at the towering ramparts, at the heavy iron gates bolted shut, and then they looked at each other. Can you imagine those Israelites after 40 years going, oh, what? What does this mean? There's this huge wall, and how will we get through it? And you would think they would go, oh, God will get us through it. But no, they still were just like, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? Let me show you a little picture. So that's Jericho. Pretty big walls, right? What should they do? No one knew, but God knew. And God told Joshua what to do. But Joshua must have looked a little surprised because it was a very odd plan of battle, as we'll soon find out. Then God made his people a promise. Listen to this, because this promise is still for us too. I will always be with you, and I will never, ever leave you. If you do what I say, your lives in this new land will be happy, and everything will go well. So he's showing them the plan. He's showing them, look, I've got this plan for you. I've taken you all these steps. Boy, you've been through a lot, and we'll study more about that in August. But those Israelites have been through so much, and they're finally here, right where they want to be, right where God has promised them would be. But he's saying, you guys have to follow me. You guys have to listen, like Samuel listened, right? You guys have to obey. So Joshua gathered all his army together. They just figured it must be, they're going to crash through Jericho or something, right? They had their swords and their spears and their shields. They were ready to fight. But the plan wasn't about fighting. It was about trusting and doing what God said. Have you ever found yourself in a time where, you know what, all I have to do is trust God? It happens almost every day. We just have to trust God. You could look for opportunities. Look for opportunities where God's saying, just trust me and I'll get you through. Instead of the worry, 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 or how am I going to do it? Let's just trust God and see how he gets you through. That's a lesson for me too, guys. All right. They were ready to fight, but the plan wasn't about fighting. It was about trusting and doing what God said. Joshua's army went marching and marching and marching around the city. Now, I will have to tell you, the person that I know who likes to march the most, it's Pastor Jim. So if you guys see this, ask Pastor Jim, do you like to march? And he'll show you. He really loves it. All right, so think of those guys all marching and marching around. They went marching day after day after day. The people of Jericho. Now, I'm going to tell you, these were really big people. And the Israelites were like, these guys they're almost like giants. They're so big and strong. And those people were looking down, the people of Jericho were looking down at the Israelites and they're like, they must be too afraid to fight. They were probably a little confused. And I think they were even laughing a little bit, going, why are these people just marching around our city, just circling and walking peacefully? What is going on? They weren't afraid. But they were wrong. The people of Jericho were wrong. God's people weren't scared. They were waiting. They were waiting for God to tell them what to do next. On the seventh day, God told his people to march around the city, but not once this time, march 7 times. Then God told everyone to make as much noise as they could. Now, has anyone ever said that to you? Make as much noise as you can. You probably spend more time with parents or teachers or whatever saying, shh, guys, be quiet and listen. And we talked a lot about that last week with Samuel. Listening is so important. But in this moment, we had to obey God. And he said, be loud. Be as loud as you can. And it was loud. Think about your family being really loud. Think about your class being really loud. This was like 40,000 people being really, really loud. So how do you think that sound was? Yeah, it was really big. All right. Well, imagine that noise and all the other people that were making that noise too. You get the idea. It was ear splitting. And as it turned out, stone splitting too, because the huge, strong walls of Jericho just crumbled to the ground as if they were sand. Could you imagine? Jericho vanished in a great cloud of dust. All right, think about that. This huge fortress, this big walls, and it wasn't a bulldozer. They didn't even have those back then. It wasn't anything strong. It was just the voices of people obeying God. So it was that God's people entered their new home. And they didn't have to fight to get in. They only had to walk and trust and obey. Joshua said, "God has brought you here safely. Now, will you do what he says?" And everyone promised, "Oh, we will. We'll do what God says." "Only God can make your heart happy," Joshua said. "So don't pray to pretend gods or idols." "No," they said, "never. We'll never do that again." I'm afraid they didn't always keep their promise. They didn't do what God said, and many years later, just as God had warned them, things would go badly for his people. They would lose their home, and enemies would capture them and take them off as slaves. We've talked about some of that. And God's people would scatter into many different lands. But God's plan was still working. One day, he would give his people another leader and another home. But this home, no one could ever take it away. Do you remember we talked last week about how all God's plans lead to Jesus, right? Jesus was going to come for all of us. So even though they didn't stay true all the time, just like we make mistakes, right? God has his plan and he walked them through. So think about that happening. Think about those walls just coming down. It's kind of like, let me see, if I pick a blade of grass, I could blow that away, right? But if I have a big stone, can I blow that away? No, I can't do anything like that on my own. Just like those Israelites couldn't knock down that fortress on their own. They had to trust God to do it. And I love when God shows himself as the mighty God, as the powerful God he is. He did that for them, for those Israelites, because he loved them. They were his people, just like we are God's people. He's so ready to show up. He's so ready to show you his plan, to show you how mighty and strong he is and how he could do anything for you. If you will just trust him and obey him, listen to him, love him. I know you guys can do that. I hope you will remember this promise. I hope you will bloom where God has planted you and watch how God wants to work through you. All right, you guys, I love you, and I'm going to see you next week. Bloom where you're planted, my friends. I'll see ya.